You're probably familiar with the plight of wildflower grassland as a habitat in the UK. We have lost well over 98% of our wildflower grassland since the 1930s. A lot of that, of course, has been due to more intensive agricultural production that is much more efficient from the point of view of producing food, but is also much more efficient at leaving less space for different species, diverse habitats to flourish. So at the moment, we have a situation right the way across the UK where the remaining fragments of grassland are very isolated and very vulnerable. Most of them are not protected by law. The environmental impact assessment regulations are poorly known and poorly applied. And as organisations trying to protect these last remnants of wildflower grassland, we are becoming increasingly conscious of their value much more broadly than just for wildlife. Of course, their value for carbon, which is what this series of seminars is all about, but also the value of wet grasslands for flood risk management, for controlling pollution coming off more intensive farmland, for maintaining healthy soils, for all kinds of different reasons. And as we become more familiar with these different issues, and as we manage to accumulate more knowledge and more research on them, it just shows us how valuable these remaining sites really are. Of course, our special wildflower grassland in North Devon, Culm grassland, that now only covers 1.4% of the area, the Culm National Character Area, or you may be more familiar with it as the land between the moors. So we have had a huge reduction in that area of Culm grassland, and you can see just from this tiny map, it shows you that we have a scattering of sites remaining across the area. The larger site you can see just in the middle of the map there is Hollow Moor, SSSI, but the vast majority of these sites are not sites of special scientific interest. They are not protected by law. They're very, very precious as a wildlife resource. And you can just see from any aerial photo the difference in the landscape. This is our Meshore Nature Reserve up in the north of North Devon. You can just see the difference between Culm grassland and the way that just simply looks with all of its associated habitats and more intensive, more industrial farmland beyond. So in North Devon, Devon Wildlife Trust has spent a lot of time over the last 10 years and beyond. I think we started way back in the late 1990s, offering one-to-one advice for landowners and offering training for landowners in what Culm grassland is all about. And we do a lot of different things. We will help landowners fill in agri-environment scheme forms, help them get plans together, help really advise them on everything to do with management of Culm grassland as a habitat, restoring it, and trying to create some species-rich wet grassland where that has been lost. So you'll see a number of different iterations here, everything from taking out conifer forest and reverting that right the way through to trying to get fencing on sites and trying to re-establish more sensitive grazing on sites. Sometimes Culm grassland can be very easy to love. It can look gorgeous right about now in the springtime following through to summer. It can be a very pleasant place to be indeed, but of course often it is really difficult even to walk through, let alone to manage. It can be a tough habitat to love. And sometimes when we're working with landowners and talk about the benefits of Culm grassland, the species in it, the wildlife in it, we get laughed at because it is generally that scrappy bit of land on the farm that the farmer hasn't been able to manage for a long time and finds it difficult to know what to do with because it is difficult to turn to anything more productive. And you could argue that that has been to the benefit of Culm grassland, really, in the fragments that are left. But of course, often it is all about trying to get the right management back on Culm grassland. Many people don't realise that this type of grassland is just as much at risk due to neglect and scrubbing up as it is due to drainage or turning to more intensive land. And it's often trying to piece together the land that needs managing, and the grazing animals that are available that can be just as tricky in trying to get these sites back into management. So here's just a quick overview of the National Character Area as a whole and the work that we have done within that. This shows you the number of farms that we have advised on over the last period. And this shows you some of the sites that we have been working on with landowners, either helping to restore them or recreate new wildflower grassland. At the moment, we have a big project just coming to its 4-year conclusion, the Culm Grassland Natural Flood Management Project, which kind of does what it says on the tin. This project runs through a number of different types of work. We want to increase our understanding not only of Culm Grassland in itself, but how it can help to manage flood risk. We want to increase the awareness of how that grassland is valued by landowners, by practitioners, by everyone working on the land really. And we want to continue the work creating and restoring grassland. We've been working a lot with the Countryside Stewardship Scheme and with well over 300 hectares of grassland restored there over the last 4 years. But it's the work on grassland creation that I want to just touch on briefly here, that we're particularly proud of. Over the last few years, Devon Wildlife Trust has increased our expertise on how to recreate lost wildlife habitat. And with the help of specialists in the area like Cyril Cole and a number of others, we have created new habitat where that habitat may have been previously destroyed. And that is through either using green hay that is harvested off existing species-rich sites and very quickly turning that around and introducing that green hay, bale chopping and putting that green hay on prepared soil, or it is about brush harvesting seed from existing sites and then putting that seed on prepared land where the soil is right for the re-establishment of that kind of grassland, and where we can go in with specialist machinery and help landowners out in creating this stuff. There's a lot to consider when we're trying to work with landowners creating new grassland. It is a change of land use, and of course that Culm grassland will be able to have less grazing value on it. It needs to have an appropriate management plan in place so that we can make sure that site is managed appropriately for wildlife-rich habitat in the future. And we've got to make sure with the landowner that that is financially viable. Is that possible to include within the farming system? What grants might be available to do that? And sometimes, as you'll be aware, farming grants can be very bureaucratic. What does that mean in terms of creating bare ground to reintroduce seed and trying to get the grazing and the fencing for subsequent management? How do we make sure that seed that we harvest through either green hay work or through brush harvesting, how can we make sure that that is as local as possible, that it's appropriate to the sites, appropriate to the climate and conditions of North Devon? How can we make sure our results are effective? How do we monitor those sites over the longer term? And how do we help landowners to buy into that for the long term? There's very little point creating new grassland if it's difficult for the landowner to manage in the long term. And how can we introduce this kind of grassland not only for nature, but also perhaps as a flood risk measure? If we can create wet grassland in particular areas, can that be used to hold back water within the landscape? Can that be used to store carbon within the landscape? How do we calculate that? And all kinds of issues that I'm sure you've been discussing over time as part of other initiatives. And how can we as a wildlife trust make sure that our landowner advice can be sustained in the long term? We tend to make sure that this kind of work is available through different funded projects, and that's part of my work as the project manager to keep that funding going. We have had a monitoring programme in place over the last 4-year project, which has been really interesting. It takes a long time to make a new wildflower meadow, and it won't be for the next 10 years or more until we know whether we are genuinely creating what might be considered culm grassland with its associated species in particular areas, or other types of wet grassland. It'll be the conditions of that particular site, the wetness of that particular site, and of course the subsequent management that will determine what kind of wildflower grassland we get in the end and what benefits that can bring. And in 2014, with some work that was done by Richard Brazier and Alan Puttock at Exeter University, we started to get really interested in the potential of culm grassland for flood storage and for pollution management and for carbon. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, PhD student at Exeter University, Nicola Ellis, who will give you a short presentation in her work on taking this research further and investigating just how culm grassland might be able to hold water within the landscape, and some early work on the carbon storage potential of culm, which I'm sure you'll be interested in. Please do get in touch with Devon Wildlife Trust. We will be hopefully at your work, at your seminar on the 11th of May. So we'll be around to answer any questions you may have, or we are in the Cookworthy office out at Hull Wills, so please do contact us. We'll be more than pleased to help out if we can.